So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Laura, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's really great to be at this museum dedicated to memory, history, and culture, looking out at the recently reopened Statue of Liberty as we speak about Jewish books. I'm so pleased to welcome two really fine and brilliant novelists, Dara Horn and Ruby Namdar. I've had the great pleasure of interviewing both of them in the past few weeks for the Jewish Week. I love their new books, Dara's Eternal Life and Ruby's The Ruined House. Sure. Thank you. And the unforgettable characters that they create. Both Dara and Ruby are careful observers, highly original and open-hearted. And they write the kind of paragraphs that you want to circle and read out loud over and over again. Interestingly, both of these novels refer back to the period of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, with references to animal sacrifice, fire, ritual, and blood, lots of blood. The really messy mysteries of antiquity, which are pretty unusual in contemporary fiction. Dara and Ruby also share interest in Jewish texts and Jewish languages, questions of memory, time, and identity, and really what it means to be fully human. But after reading their new books back to back, I was struck by these many parallels and thought it would be great to bring them together since they'd have so much to say to one another. I think their paths have crossed and intersected in lots of interesting ways, and I know they admire each other's work, but I think this might be their first real literary conversation. Yes. So thanks. We'll be talking about their novels, and we're going to try not to give away too much of the plots so that you'll have the real pleasure of reading afterwards. But just a show of hands, I wonder how many people have read either one or both books? Great.
There will be a test at the end.
Yeah.
So the format for tonight is that I'm going to briefly introduce them. Then they're each going to read just a short piece from their books to give you a flavor of the writing. Then we'll have a conversation, and we'll have some time for your questions afterwards. And then after that, you can buy their books and have time to greet them informally and have your book signed. I just want to take a moment before we start to thank the Wieseltier of the Jewish Week and the team here at the museum for putting this evening together. So let's just give them a little round of applause. So now on to the authors. They have very long and distinguished bios, but I'm going to give you the very brief versions. Dara Horn is the author of 4 previous novels, and she's received 2 National Jewish Book Awards, the Harold Ribelow Prize, and other honors. She has a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard, and she's taught at Harvard, Sarah Lawrence, and other universities. In 2007, she was named by Granta as one of the best young American novelists. Dara lives in New Jersey with her husband and 4 children. And I've known Dara for many years, since her very first book. And I think we did the interview in her apartment like days after she had given birth. And Ruby grew up in Jerusalem. His first novel won the Israel Ministry of Culture's Award for Best First Publication. His second novel, which we're going to be talking about, The Ruined House, won Israel's most prestigious literary award, the Sapir Prize. That's when it was published in Hebrew, and this new English edition was translated by Hillel Holkin. Ruby lives with his wife and 2 daughters on the Upper West Side, and we've also known each other for some years, but really sat down for the first time to talk about his book. So I thought maybe we'll start with Dara to read.
Sure. Either everything matters, or everything is an outrageous waste of time. That's what she would have said if anyone had asked her. But no one asks crazy old ladies for their opinions. If her father had described it, it was his job to write, or at least to copy. He might have written, "These are the generations of Rachel, keeper of vows, who bargained with God and lived." If her son had written it, her first son, the wise one, the reason for everything that followed, he would have put it differently. If all the heavens were parchment and all the seas ink, such would not suffice to record the days of Rachel, whose years are no more than an eye blink of the master of the world. If her 20th son had written it, he would have sprinkled it with rose petals until it reeked. O mother of thousands, she who escaped the sword, most loved, most honored, most blessed of the Lord, or something equally trite. He was no poet, but the delusion had been harmless. Her 63rd son would have written something else, in a different language this time, though still the same alphabet. If you like, dear reader, I'll tell you a story you'll never forget for as long as you live, about how my mother once made a promise she forever regretted. Just don't tell anyone that I told you. The day's meeting had been awkward. Just getting into the office above the store had meant crossing through a line of 7 people holding signs. The signs said, "Boycott Zakai gemstones," and "Divest from Zionist occupiers." It was odd, she thought. She wasn't Israeli, at least not the way these people thought. Or rather, she was Israeli in exactly the way these people thought. In either case, it made no sense. Her grandchildren upstairs had an explanation, though not a good one. "They've got the wrong store," one announced. "They think we're the Bukharian guy." No one named the Bukharian guy. It was company policy never to name the Bukharian guy. "If they think we're the Bukharian guy, they'll be pretty disappointed when all we have to divest is 85 cents, another one added. Rachel rolled her eyes, a gesture she had picked up along with English years ago, and everyone laughed. As the meeting proceeded, she looked around the table at them, her children, her grandchildren, familiar faces, repeating faces. She had done well, she thought, in this version. Version was the word she used when thinking of it, nusach, the liturgical term, like a melodic variation on a theme. This version was one of the best, the happiest, which is why she hadn't wanted to leave. But she couldn't stay forever. She ran the meeting strictly, as she had for the past few years. Trivial details flowed through her days. Long ago, when the details were different, she had wondered if those details that filled every minute of every day were actually concealing something large and still and sacred. Many days and years and people had passed before she understood that the details themselves were the still and sacred things, that there was nothing else, that the curtain of daily life itself was holy, that behind it was only a void. As she rose to leave, one son stopped her. "Mom, before you go," he said, "the new lawyer suggested a few modifications to the will. Nothing major, but he noticed that nothing's been signed." She paused and spoke. "I'm not signing." "Mom, you're 84 years old. I'll be 62 next week," her oldest son said. Her oldest son, she thought, and smirked. "We all know you're well now. Honestly, I wish I felt half as good as you do. And none of us want to say this to you, but no one lives forever." The youngest granddaughter had been fiddling with her phone under the table, but now she looked up. Haven't you noticed? Graham is the exception to that rule. She might as well sell her plot. It's not like she's going to use it." Rachel turned to her granddaughter and grinned. "Exactly," she announced. "I am the head of this company, and I have made an executive decision not to die." And then she walked out of the room. What haunted her most about the children was how many times they died. New parents think of each day as a cascade of beginnings. The first time she smiled, the first time she rolled over, her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. But old parents, like her, saw only endings. The last time she crawled, the last time she spoke in a pure, raw sound unsculpted into the words of others. The last time she stood before the world in braids and laughed when she shouldn't have, not knowing. Each child died before the person did, a small rehearsal for the future. She raised her children, all of them. She raised them, nurtured them, watched them love or hate or succeed or fail. Then she finally watched her children die, and she was jealous. She would tell that granddaughter, she decided, as she left the building. Yet it was this granddaughter, of all her articulate descendants, who announced online to the universe, "My grandmother just told us she can't sign off on her will because she can't die. Hashtag crazy old lady." Oh, child, she thought, you have no idea just how crazy I am.
Ruby,
Okay.
please.
I will. My accent is not as good as hers. You'll have to forgive me. One clear morning, on the 6th day of the Hebrew month of Elul, the year 5760, counting from the creation of the world, which happened to fall on Wednesday, September 6th, 2000, the gates of heaven were opened above the great city of New York, and behold, all 7 celestial spheres were revealed right above the West 4th Street subway station. layered one on top of another, like the rungs of a ladder reaching skyward from the earth. Errant souls flitted there like shadows, one alone, bright to the point of transparency, the figure of an ancient priest, his head wrapped in a linen turban and a golden firepan in his hand. No human eye beheld this, nor did anyone grasp the enormity of the moment, a time of grace in which not a prayer would have gone unanswered. No one but an old homeless man who lay on the bench, filthy and bloated with hunger, shrouded in his tatters, wishing himself dead. He passed instantly, without pain. A blissful smile lingered on his face, the smile of a reprobate, his penance completed, granted eternal rest. At that exact hour, not far away, in a trendy cafe in the lobby of the Levitt building, which looked out onto Washington Square Park, Andrew P. Cohen, professor of comparative culture at New York University, sat preparing the open lecture of his course, The Critique of Culture, or The Culture of Critique, an introduction to comparative thought. It was required for students majoring in comparative culture, and Cohen taught it every fall. Ignore that. Cohen specialized in elegantly naming his courses, which attracted students from every department and were always fully enrolled. It was more than just their names, though. His courses were well conceived and well rounded. For all their incisiveness, their main strength lay in the aesthetic harmony of their superbly formulated interpretative models, which were easy to understand and absorb. In general, elegant was the adjective most commonly applied to anything bearing the imprint of Professor Andrew P. Cohen. The entirety of him merited it. His dress and appearance, his speech and body language, his ideas and their expression, all had a refined aristocratic finish that splendidly gilded everything he touched. Although many attributed this special feeling to Cohen's charisma, they were aware of the cheap inadequacy of this term. Charisma he had, for sure, yet there was something else too, something elusive. A student of his, Angela Maranti, a bright young filmmaker who specialized in advanced visual technologies, once articulated it. He has an aura. This remark was made in the cafeteria following Cohen's weekly research seminar. Cohen hadn't led the discussion that week. He sat alongside his students, listening to a guest lecturer from gender studies who spoke about the covert sexual biases in the supposedly gender-neutral world of virtual reality. You see, Angela explained to the bespectacled doctoral student who had accompanied her through this emergency exit so that she could smoke a forbidden cigarette. It's not the aura her fingers sketch ironic quotation marks in the air that the phony New Age mystics talk about. It's more like Hollywood or TV. You see it in celebrities, especially if they're in a private setting, away from the spotlight, at a party or at some restaurant. They have this halo, as if they hadn't removed their makeup and the lights were still on them. They're shiny. Their skin actually glows. Come on, let's go back. She threw the burning cigarette butt on the floor and strode inside, the doctoral student on her heels. They don't look real, that's the thing. They are unreal. They're like wax models of themselves, perfectly executed and lit. I suppose it's an accomplishment of a sort to turn yourself into an icon and become a symbol of who you are, or rather, of what you are. You know what I mean, right? The doctoral student, who was slightly in love with Angela, just as she was slightly in love with Cohen, nodded eagerly. despite the fact that she was not at all sure that she did in fact know. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So those were actually both the very beginnings of these novels. Maybe before we get to the high priests and fire, maybe you could each just step back a second and tell us a bit more about the main character and their predicament they find themselves in. We have Rachel and Andrew Cohen. We don't know Rachel's last name, but Andrew's last name is particularly significant as well. So Dara, tell us a bit more about Rachel.
Sure. So the reason she doesn't have a last name is because she's a woman who's been alive for 2,000 years. So she's had a lot of last names. My main character is a woman who can't die. And while this may sound like not a particularly original idea, I mean, there's many, many stories about immortal characters. Very few of them are about fertile women. So this is someone who has been married many, many times, has had hundreds and hundreds of children, and outlived all of them. But the point where it really, where our books, I think, really intersect is that the way that she ends up in this predicament is because of a vow that she makes in the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and she does this in order to save the life of her child, and of course, then the temple is destroyed, and there's no way for her to get out of this vow, and so she's stuck with this. She's stuck in this never-ending life for 2,000 years, which is more than a little bit of a metaphor for Jewish history. So we can say more, but I want to see where this conversation takes us.
Yes.
Thanks. Ruby.
So my novel is it takes place mostly in New York of the year 2000, but it is time and space are not so clear there. It tells a story of Andrew Cohen, who is like a caricature of the successful New Yorker. He is a very charming, elegant, successful man at the height of his career. He publishes in all the right places. He speaks in all the right places. He's, as we call it ironically, happily divorced, has his relationships with his ex-wife and daughters exactly where he wants them. He has a young girlfriend that used to be his grad student, half his age. And he, most enviably, he occupies alone a spectacular apartment in the Upper West Side with full frontal river views. And need I say more? And the novel goes with Andrew for a year in his life, through which the carefully constructed structures of his life all begin to unravel, as does his mind. And as this happens, he begins to see visions of the Holy Temple and the acts of the sacrificial practices of the priestly clan. And he has no tools, emotional or interpretative, to understand what he sees and to understand the relevance. And these visions become stronger and stronger and almost threaten to swallow him into them. And I will not give up the end.
So what drew you to this period, to the Second Temple? And I wonder what the relevance is in your own life and in ours, perhaps?
So for me, when I write about the temple, I actually it's not a historic era for me. It is a mythological era. And all of the way I handle the symbol of the temple and the absent temple is not done through any historicist prism at all, but it is rather through the collective memory and the collective imagination. And the symbol of the temple was preserved in the amber of our memory, like frozen there for many generations. And it's only recently that for many of us, it has ceased to be a central, a focal point. It was a place where our ancestors were talking about and thinking about and visualizing on a daily basis through prayers. And every time somebody went to shul and prayed, they basically were enacting a sacrificial ceremony that is no longer there. So basically, we were still, until very recently, when I say recently, I'm talking about the mid-19th century, it began to to be undone, this pining for the temple, Jews were nothing short of obsessed with this trauma of the destruction of the temple and the loss of the home of the people and of God. And this is the place where I go into. So it's really not historic, but and that's why for me, the way that I handled the temple was only from within the Jewish canon, from Talmudic, Mishnaic, and Midrashic literature, where it is already shrouded in mythology.
Yeah, same question. How did you get there?
Yeah, well, so in terms of how to this period, this historical period, well, I mean, I think that I first started thinking about this idea of this immortal woman. I joke that this is actually my most autobiographical book, because I'm 2,000 years old, as you can see. No, really, because as you mentioned earlier, I have 4 children, and something happens when you have a larger family, which is that sort of events keep repeating. It's like, you go to another graduation, you go to another graduation, you go to another, it's just like, it gets hard to be nostalgic about these things, because it's just like, you feel like, nothing ever changes. And it's sort of, I just felt like, wow, I'm just like going to be continuously going to preschool graduations for the rest of my life. And I sort of thought like, well, what if that was actually true? And having this experience of, I'm from quite a large family. My parents have, as I dedicated the book to 14 grandchildren. And, I remember once asking my mother, like, this thing where people say it goes by so fast, does it go by so fast? And my mother just looks at me like I'm stupid, and she's like, it's interminable. So there was sort of like, a little bit of a human family element to this story. But what interested me is that all of my writing tends to be about the idea of time. And what started me as a writer, even as a child, was this fear of days disappearing. And I was really, my interest in Judaism is not only from a religious and a cultural standpoint, but because I feel like this was a culture that was designed to address this problem. And part of it is what Ruby talked about in that idea that there's like the obsession with the trauma of the destruction of the temple. There's a total obsession with the past and everything in Judaism, right? Like the entire religion is based on this idea that like time is not in fact linear. Like, in fact, you personally have come out of Egypt, right? I mean, everything about Jewish culture is designed to is designed under the assumption that the past is living within the present. Yes. And so that idea of having someone live forever was really it's that 2,000-year life of something that should have been dead. And that was really what brought me to that idea of the temple, was because that sort of is this, as Ruby says, it is this sort of like central loss that shapes Jewish life for everything that goes forward. But it's also, it's this turning point in Jewish life where Judaism starts out as this sacrificial cult, which I was once asked to give a Devar Torah, right, a speech about one of the Torah portions that was one of these in Leviticus that's just about sacrificing goats. And I did it in a poem where that I wrote, which was, one little goat, repeat it now and learn by rote. To master all of Jewish lore, stand not on 1 foot, but on 4. There's more of this, but I'm not going to bore you. But the idea being that this was like really like the whole focus of this religion was like about killing goats. And then suddenly the temple is destroyed and they have to like find something else to do, right? I mean, and there already was a tradition of sages and studying of Torah that was started. One of the characters in my book is Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is one of the sages at the time of the destruction of the temple, who had himself carried out of Jerusalem by faking his own death when the city was under siege. And he convinced the Roman general Vespasian, later Emperor Vespasian, to allow him to create an academy for sages in the city of Yavne. Outside of Jerusalem. And really, this is sort of the beginning of, this is what makes Judaism survive, is that he turns all of those rituals, as Ruby said, everything in Jewish liturgical life is like based on what used to be a temple service. Yochanan ben Zakkai is not the only person who does this, but he sort of decides to like, well, let's just turn all that into a metaphor, and then we can take it with us wherever we go. And so what I did in this novel was I basically turned that transition and that history, and what that meant was suddenly you had this religion that was like, in a sense, it became immortal, right? Because there was nothing to destroy. It was all just ideas that you were passing between generations. And so then you had, and there is, I think, something surreal about the survival of the Jewish people, right? That, that you don't need to believe in anything supernatural to think that this is extremely strange, that you have, thousands of years of this tradition that is evolving, but essentially the same, and that really shouldn't still be here. And so what I did in this book is I just took all of those ideas and I turned them into a person. And so that was how I got this idea of going back 2,000 years.
Yeah. Can I add one thing?
Please.
I think that what you said about the memory of Mitzrayim and that every person has to feel that they individually, I think
Came
that
out of
there's
Egypt.
a very
Yes.
interesting point there where you turned your book about like an individual journey and basically embodying the memory.
Yes.
And I do it in my way with embodying a forgotten collective memory. But I think the point here is really, as you said, that the memory and the past kind of becomes part of the DNA of the individual. So it's really as if we're carrying it in our cells, in our body, really. And the term embodiment is sometimes it's an abstract term, but it actually, no, it's a visceral term. So we became the carriers, really, like carriers as if it's a virus. But it's a virus that we're not willing to part with. It's embedded almost in a visceral way in us, memory. And that, I think, is something that connects our novels in a very interesting and fascinating way.
Ruby, what about time? It seems really significant in your novel, too, and that it takes place over the course of 1 year with Jewish time noted along with...
Yes. Well, as Dara noted well before, we have a very funny way of dealing with time in Jewish civilization because we're all about time, but when we defy time, and time is everything, but time is nothing, en mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah, so within Scripture, once you enter this wonderful rabbit hole of Scripture, and there's nothing else, and time ceases to exist. And the rabbis have no issue saying that Yitzchak, Isaac, was actually celebrating Pesach, and the two goats that Rebecca sent with Jacob to bring to Isaac are actually this Pesach sacrifice. And it makes absolutely no sense, but it makes sense in this wonderful, absurd way because time ceases to exist. So this wonderful gift of being so serious and yet so skeptical about time, for me, is one of the great gifts that our Jewish culture gave us. And as fiction writers, it's heaven to receive this gift, right? To be able to play with time. Now, I did emphasize 2 times that are almost rival times and definitely are fighting for the reader's attention. And by making a point of and I'm so happy that people notice that and they work with me there, making a point of giving every scene a very exact date in the Hebrew calendar and in the Gregorian, in the general calendar, according to which we all live our everyday life. And by doing this, I wanted to create 2 parallel universes, 2 parallel realities. If you want a solar reality and a lunar reality, a revealed reality and a hidden one. Because we all are living in these 2 life cycles. We are part of the world, very much so, but we also live according to this hidden calendar. Now, I have a great anecdote for that because the person who did the wonderful job at HarperCollins, like making sure that all the little glitches, and he wrote back and he says, we have a few problems with the dates because sometimes the dates match and sometimes they don't. And I said, can they please look at the time of the day in which this happens? Because much to our bafflement, the Jewish day begins at sunset, while the general day begins at midnight. So if a scene happens after sunset, now, of course, I had to sit and see exactly when sunset was in every one of these days. It was a crazy project. My wife is shaking her head, yes. And certain scenes had to have mismatched dates because the Jewish day has started, but the Gregorian day not yet.
Great. So let's shift a little bit over to language. It's really interesting that Dara, you know Yiddish and Hebrew, and Ruby, you speak Farsi and Hebrew, and I wonder how these other Jewish languages work their way into your writing, and as well as your deep engagement with Jewish texts.
Sure.
Dara.
Well, so I actually started writing my novels. This is already my 5th book, but I started doing this actually out of jealousy of writers who, like Ruby, are able to write in Hebrew and in Yiddish and in other Jewish languages. And the reason I was jealous of these writers was because they were able to do so easily what Ruby does so beautifully in his book, and which, fortunately, you can access it in translation, but it's so much richer in Hebrew, which is interlacing these texts from different periods into a contemporary story. Ruby does this in his book really explicitly, where he has passages that are written in a kind of a Mishnaic or Talmudic prose, like using ancient literary forms directly in the book. But even writers who are not consciously engaging in this, and this is true in Yiddish, which is the other language I was studying as well. It's just part of the language. It's you almost can't help but make these references to the Torah and to these other ancient texts, in the same way that I think every language has an archaeology of belief built into it, right? I mean, if you're speaking in English and you say to somebody, go the extra mile, you're not thinking, oh, I'm quoting the Gospels, but I mean, that's what you're doing, and you just aren't. It's not conscious, right? I mean, oh, this will happen for better or for worse. You're not like, oh, I'm quoting the Anglican marriage ceremony, but that's what you're doing. So those kinds of references in Jewish languages are, of course, all from the Torah and the Siddur and the Talmud and all of these Jewish sources going back thousands of years. And I felt in English literature, in Jewish literature written in English, that there was this real loss in not being able to include those resonances for readers who were reading in English and wouldn't be able to access them. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if there was some way to put these things into English? And to write in English as though English were a Jewish language. So, and what I mean by that is not to have a lot of words in italics, but to have a story that that includes these references in a way that feels natural to the story, that doesn't sort of stick out like you need to have a footnote, and not every reader would get every single reference, but that the ones that are essential to the plot are going to have somehow be elegantly explained or described in the course of the story. So that's something that I thought about a lot in writing all of my novels. And in this book, especially, there are chapters that are, most of the book is contemporary and takes place in contemporary in New York and New Jersey. But there are important scenes that take place in Roman-occupied Jerusalem. And it was important to me to have the characters speaking in the same way that they would, because it's actually, in my book, the same people who are speaking then and who are speaking now, and they're speaking in maybe, if they're speaking to each other, they're speaking the same language then and now. And so I needed the voices to be consistent, and that was important to me. But I also sort of put these little references into the book throughout everything that I write, and some references some readers will notice, and some references they won't, but there's sort of, I try to include all these sort of moments from Jewish history and Jewish text in the books, which readers can access in different ways, but I do feel that what I'm trying to do is to give the English language reader, no matter what their background is, the experience of reading something that's written in a language that goes back thousands of years.
So what's an example of how you use Yiddish?
Okay, so in this book? Okay, so in this book, actually the first, I skipped it because I didn't want to take too long in the reading, but on that first page or two of the book, her 63rd son, who is the one who, he says like, oh, here's what the 63rd son would have said, if you were writing a book about her. And there's a little paragraph right after that where it says, that 63rd son was, and his brothers were always driving her crazy, and she lost her temper all the time with them until one day the 63rd son during dinner got up on a chair and declaimed a rhymed alphabetical list of all of the curses that she had been hurling at him, and then went on to write all these brilliant, hilarious novels that still made her laugh. That's actually an anecdote from from Sholem Aleichem's autobiography, from the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem. He talks about how when he was a child, his stepmother was always cursing him out, and him and his brothers, and that he created this alphabetized list of his stepmother's curses in rhyme, and that this was his first literary work. He considers that like the first work he ever wrote. And so there's like a lot of little things like that I put into the book and that I intersperse. Some of them I make into her life, or I make it into her children's lives. There are many sort of characters from Jewish history who appear throughout her life and her family.
Great, thanks. Ruby rhymed Persian curses in your book?
I don't think that I have yet to write my great Persian Jewish novel, which I maybe will and maybe won't. I'm from Persian Jewish ancestry on both sides, and we have a great story in our community. We were Marranos for 5 generations, hidden Jews. My ancestors had to pretend to be Muslims. It's a very rich story, and I don't personally do a lot of autobiographical writing. But who knows? The question of languages, I think, is very important, because the mere fact that we are here deliberating how many languages can we enact in one, that makes us so Jewish. It is the opposite of what usually people think of, like the mastery, literary mastery, is that you own a language and you are kind of going all the way down to its roots. And I think that there's this linguistic neurosis, which is wonderful, in Jewish literature, where if you think about it, so many of the Jewish authors are playing with this kind of nervousness around language, and also a certain, I almost want to call it greed, because it's so wonderful to have all these languages and to play with them and to want them and to own them. So it's a very lush situation, this situation of betwixt and between languages. And I actually think that if you're not lucky, you don't speak any of the languages, and you can't really form a clear thought. But if you are lucky and work hard at it, you actually can be very good and very deep with a few languages. And in that case, it's really a wonderful gift. And again, I think very Jewish. So for me, the same thing with the dual time is also with the dual, triple, quadruple situation of languages that makes these works very Jewish. Now, in the case of my novel, as Dara again said so well, the game is also between certain layers of the Hebrew, because biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, Talmudic Aramaic, and modern Hebrew are very different languages. They are related, but they're not the same. So that gives me a place to work and play and create this.
Now, how do you translate that into English? Hillel Halkin's brilliant.
Look, Hillel Halkin, I keep saying there was probably one person in the world who had big enough in English, big enough in Hebrew, and big enough in ego. I'm his biggest fan. He's amazing. And to take this on, and also to know when to not be tempted, to just grab one more reference, to let go of some of the reference gems because they don't work in English, and that would create this stilted Hebrew book that happens to be written in English that I would love to write, but nobody wants to read. So that is, one of the things I admire about the translation, that he knew when to let go, which is something that is a master's quality.
What about humor? Both books deal with these very weighty subjects, and they're both like really funny. I wonder if the humor comes naturally to you, and if you also find your own work funny as you're writing and reading.
I would say it does come naturally to me in that I actually think we've been talking about this sort of trauma and loss in Jewish history. I actually think Jewish history is really funny. And I mean, like, I may be alone in that, but I mean, I think it's really funny because it's so absurd, right? I mean, it's like whack-a-mole, right? I mean, it's like you just keep trying. It's like people trying to kill us over here, you kill us over here, you kill us over here. It's like it doesn't really work. I mean, it's just like so ridiculous. There's something just so completely ridiculous about it that I find really hilarious. And in integrating this and sort of just also, I mean, there's I think a lot of humor with the contrast between. And we've both sort of talked about this a little bit, but our books are so centered on it. There's a really different perspective of time in American and in Jewish life, right? Yeah. And we've talked about that a little bit already, but the idea that we didn't really talk about so much is in contrast with the American view of time, which is that only things that are new matter. Right, and anything that's not new, like it's you build like a Walmart on an Indian burial ground, you're like, there's a Walmart now, and so that's sort of whereas like in Israel, it's like you got to get a building permit just to like dig a basement, and then of course you discover a bunch of coins from the Maccabean era, right? So this is a really different view of time, and also it's everything about like the way we conceive of ourselves as Americans is this idea that we don't have a past, right? Like the whole mythology of the American dream is that it doesn't matter where you come from, and it's what you do with this country gives you. And whether or not it's true, I mean, it's basically saying that you have this ability to erase your own past, right, and that it doesn't matter. So, I mean, I think that that's hilarious. And so one of the things that I did in this novel is that I mentioned before that I have this main character, of course the main character is the one, it lives for 2,000 years. There's also in the novel one other person who's in the same situation as this woman. Like your bad high school boyfriend or girlfriend who just like never leaves you alone, never goes away, never gets it that you've really broken up. So imagine if that person really never goes away. And they're like stalking you for 2,000 years. And they're like, no, we're really meant to be together forever. And you're like, no, we're still not. And they're like, no, like, how about now? And you're like, no, still not. And so there's this, what's funny is some people read this as an epic tale of true love, and others will read it as an epic tale of stalking, and it kind of depends on your point of view which one it is. And so, I mean, to me, this is very funny. There's also, to me, a little bit of an echo of the rabbinic idea of the relationship between God and the people of Israel is that they perceive it as a romance. And I've always thought that's very funny because I'm like, if that's a romance, I'm like, this is a really messed up romance. And I was like, let's say it's complicated, right? I would say it's very complicated romance. So a lot of that is enacted in these two characters. And so this person, and so an example of that sort of contrast between the ridiculousness of thinking there's no past is this in his modern incarnation, this boyfriend who never goes away, who originally was the son of the high priest, now is an internet troll. And just like is harassing people online, especially this woman. And I mean, and he has like this Twitter feed, right, which is just where he's like is just constantly harassing scientists who are trying to develop life extension technologies, and he just inserts himself into their conversations online. And so you have these things where, someone will post something like, these Silicon Valley people who want to live forever, like, life is, your problem is you think it's about winning. Life isn't about winning. Life is about the adventure. I say, bring it on. And he's like, yes, bring it on. 17 expulsions, 5 beheadings, 12 of my kids gassed to death. Bring it on. And then the person writes back, they're like, plenty of time to find the silver lining, isn't there? So, there's sort of this ongoing humor in the book that's sort of, to me, it comes just from the absurdity. I mean, and there's an absurdity, too, to the personal aspect of the book, which is, that this is really also the story of, I mean, a lot of us are familiar with the classic Mel Brooks routine about the 2,000-year-old man. What's even funnier than the 2,000-year-old man is the 2,000-year-old mom, right? I mean, because this is just, someone who really, after 2,000 years, his favorite thing in the world was, the best invention was saran wrap, right? So, I mean, the 2,000-year-old mom really appreciates saran wrap, but she doesn't have time to talk to you about it. And so there's this kind of futility of being a parent and, having this constant responsibility that never, ever goes away. But there's a lot of humor in that, too, because there's this delusion of control. So, yeah.
Nice. So my basic tendencies as a writer are tragic, which is funny because those who know me in the everyday life know I'm a kind of a party animal, and I like people. I like life, and I love people, and I laugh. But as a writer, there is a strong tragic. I always find myself writing tragedies. I mean, I love to tell the story about my agent who sat with me trying to understand my next book is about, and like, her face kind of became a little worried, and then she looked at me in this desperate hope, and she said, is it funny? And I said, no, not funny, sorry. But then,
I thought your book was funny.
thank you. And then, much to my own surprise, I found myself also having fun and allowing the humor to come out. And it was really one of the places where I surprised myself, and I'm so happy that it happened, that it didn't become this kind of heavy-handed, tragedy, but that it has a layer of, I think, certain ironic, almost sarcastic, I don't know how to qualify this humor, but that there is a humor, and that there are many scenes in which maybe this self-importance of the protagonist as becomes a joke unbeknownst to him, and sometimes even he realizes that he's a joke, but he's so trapped in the cliche. So it was actually a very fresh moment for me to understand that I can and am doing humor too. It wasn't part of my self-conception. I look at Dara, and you know that you're also funny. And it's not a funny book.
My children are not that amused by me.
I see. Well, this is a loss. They make a point of not laughing at our jokes. Yes.
But about family, you both come from really loving families, and you both seem like you put a lot of creativity into the way you raise your kids as well as into your writing. And I wonder, what's interesting to you in writing about these families that are so less than perfect?
You first.
Oh, yikes. Well, I mean, all families are less than perfect, right? I mean, there's if the happy families are all like thing, it's just really like you just don't know them well enough, right? But I think that I see that my children are very young, and I don't know what our lives will be like in the future. I don't know what their lives will be like in the future, but I have the same concerns and hesitations as every parent has. And so one thing that I have the ability to do with these books is to kind of turn that into, sort of project that out and see where that takes me. And so at one point when one of my children was driving me up the wall, I kind of projected this into the novel, and I gave her a 56-year-old son who has moved back in with her and lives in her basement. She's 85. I mean, she's 2000, but she's like 80. Sort of like the idea that it's like, well, what if this problem never resolved itself? Like, what if it never went away? And you sort of and you get to sort of play with those ideas. And the amazing thing about writing these characters in this book is that she has all of these families, right? She has the dysfunctional families, she has the happy families, she has the marriages that work beautifully, the marriages that don't work so beautifully, right? I mean, she has experienced this, this real range of family relationships, and what she sees though also is that, and this is something that I see as a mother of four, which is that. I think parents maybe who have smaller families and might be able to delude themselves into thinking that they have some kind of impact on their child and on what how the child turns out. And once you have a few more, you're sort of like, no, that was just a coincidence. You sort of see the limits of your control. And she really, as a person who has hundreds and hundreds of children over the course of thousands of years, sees exactly what those limits are. Right, exactly what she can and can't do for her children. And what she really sees is that there's really nothing more that you can do for them other than to love them. And that's, which in some cases is a very hard thing to do. But that's what you also see in this book is that, right up to that limit of what she can do for them but there is no limit to her love for her children.
Ruby, the family you create is quite fractured.
Yes, it is, and there's a lot to say about this. First of all, I as a kid, I was a bit envious of kids with dysfunctional families, if you know what I mean, because we were so insultingly normal, and so middle class, and parents who are devoted and annoying, and at home for dinner every time. It was so not. And everybody's in everybody's business, and everybody's devoted until you don't know what to do with yourself. And then there were the kids who had less perfect families, and they're the ones who were sexy and weird, and they're the first people to smoke and have sex, and they were living dangerously, and that they had all these dramas. Of course, when I established my own family, I became exactly the annoying hands-on Jewish parent who like runs home to feed the kids, and like there's no. But so there's more drama in the, although that's of course not true, because we all know that there's a lot of stifling drama in the normal family. But let's say that it's a lower hanging fruit with a dysfunctional family. But I also want to say that there's something about the fractured home and the marriage and that for me goes deeper into the mythology of our religious mythology. And that is that our holy families all had issues with marriage, and the Holy Family, which is God, Shekhinah. So our theology, and recently I'm studying more Kabbalistic texts. I study Zohar and Gloriani Kabbalah, so that's all over the place. So actually, the story of divinity in Jewish mysticism is of a broken marriage. And that goes all the way to the Nevi'im, to the prophets, where one by one, it is not a normal, happy family. It is a story of a broken marriage with some longing for a past, but a broken present. And so for me, to create this was also a theological statement. And I was also tapping into the deep archetype of the broken marriage as a metaphor for the divinity and the crack between the creator and creation.
Great. So I thought we'd maybe turn to you and see if there are questions in the audience. Otherwise, I've got plenty more. So if you want to raise your hand and.
I have a mic to bring to whoever is asking
Great.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. You talked a lot about time, and you alluded a little bit about the betwixt and between to the other axis, which is space.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask both of you, one book I've read and one book I will be reading, if you could talk about yourselves as insiders, outsiders in space, and how that informs your writing of this book, your books.
Great. I'm just going to repeat the question for the sake of our TV audience. This is questions about time and space, and to talk about yourselves as both inside and outside of space and time.
Well, shall I start?
Sure.
For me, it's pretty clear because I am in transition in many ways. I mean, first of all, I was born to a family of immigrants in Israel. So I already felt, growing up in Israel, I was born in Jerusalem, but I was first generation, and it was pretty close, especially my mother who immigrated to Israel only a few years before I was born. So I've always been, even in Israel, growing up in Jerusalem, at the same time an insider and an outsider. I was not quite as comfortable in my skin as many of my Sabra friends who were second, third generation, and really they felt the place in their bones. So for me, there was always a bit of like, I didn't really know how to walk on these sidewalks. I mean, I had to make it up as I was walking. And then, of course, 18 years ago, I moved to New York, and that became a second displacement, I must say, a very pleasant and happy one. I mean, if one should be an exiled author, this would be this is the way to do it. But it for sure informs my writing and my experience. I mean, even the fact that I still write fiction in Hebrew, and when I live in New York, is in itself a warp. It's in itself a double existence, and the idea of place as you pointed out well, for me is really a very complex idea and very complex experience, because I am at the same time here, very much in New York, very much in my life, feeling totally at home here. And at the same time, I'm of another place, and I work in another place when I write. So I think that this tension is very present in my work. I feel it enriches it. I'm not looking to normalize this. I learned to embrace this insider-outsider experience and to actually understand that it's a source of strength and even happiness for me.
I have quite the opposite experience in that I'm not only a fourth-generation American, but my family is, and now my children are now fifth-generation Americans, but we're not only fourth-generation American or fifth-generation American, fifth-generation New Jersey, fifth-generation Essex County, New Jersey. And so much so that I live in the town where I grew up. My children go to the schools where I went. My daughter and I had the same kindergarten teacher. My parents live around the corner. My sister lives around the next corner. My other sister is really far away in the next town on the border of our town. And my brother's really far away in Westchester. So, but I feel extremely rooted in the place where I live, and yeah, I'm living like in a 19th century shtetl, except that it's in New Jersey in the 21st century, where it's like, you know, we have multiple generations all in one place. So very much the opposite experience, and also totally monolingual in that I learned Hebrew and Yiddish out of my own interest. It wasn't something that came from my family. It's not like, oh, my parents were speaking Yiddish, nothing like that. Even my grandparents didn't speak Yiddish, so, or maybe understood it but didn't speak it. So it's like none of that is. I feel very rooted in the place where I live. At the same time, one thing that sort of animates my writing is that Judaism is so centered on Israel and Jerusalem, right? I mean, all of the sort of the whole liturgical structure, as we've been talking about, is really centered on Israel and Jerusalem, and so. That is also a place that I feel I know really well and where I feel very much at home, not only from visiting there many, many times in my life, but also from the languages and, being at home in those texts. So in the novel, I've sort of situated my characters in that way as well. So a lot of the novel takes place in this area. There's a nature reservation that's in my town where I walk every morning, and I have some scenes that take place in that nature reservation, and there's some things that are very locally rooted there. But the key scenes of the book take place in Jerusalem, and what's interesting to me is that you made a distinction in your question between space and time, but in a sense, in a place like Jerusalem, there isn't really a distinction between space and time because you go down underground and you're going back in time, right? So some of the key scenes in this novel take place in Hezekiah's tunnel, which is this water tunnel that was carved 3,000 years ago to protect the city's water supply from a siege. And this is a place you can go now as a tourist, and you go underground and you're in this place which is from 3,000 years ago. So in a sense, I think that we're mistaken if we think that place and time are really separate, because certainly, and I think it's true in everywhere, but it's especially, it's really visible in a place like Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. Another question? Yes. Wait, just.
For both of you, where did you get your ideas for your novels? How did they come to you? And how long did it take for each of you to write the book that you wrote?
So where did you get your ideas? How did they come from you? And how long did it take to write?
He wants to think about it too. So we're both like, you talk so I can think of an answer. It's a harder. I think it's a question that writers dread because it's like I think readers expect you to have like this epiphany moment, right, where you're like, and suddenly I had this brilliant flash of, and that's actually usually not what happens. But I did. For me in this novel, I had been thinking about how. Most of my novels are lots of different characters and usually living in different places and times, and the stories are kind of interwoven. And I had been, with each of my novels, I sort of set up a challenge for myself, and I want to do something different that I haven't done in previous books. And in this book, one of the things that I was setting up for myself was that I wanted to have for lack of a better term, a simple story. Like something where it was the same reality that we live in, but really maybe only change one thing. Right?
I love that you call this a simple story. imagine a complicated story.
Yeah, my other books are more.
This is so beautifully complex.
Yeah, well, thank you. But so what's in a sense, it was about focusing it on this one character. I had been asked. I was invited to speak in Australia about 3 years ago, and about one of my other books, but they also asked me to sort of present a piece of original fiction that that had not been published before, which was a problem for me because I don't write short stories and I hadn't written anything, and so luckily there's a really long flight to Australia, and I wrote something about the idea of daylight savings time and that extra hour that you get, and it's like a gift. So suddenly you have this hour that you didn't know you ever had, and I wrote it sort of. And it was sort of a little parable story about Adam and Eve and this hour that they suddenly are given by God that they didn't expect to have, and what they do with that extra hour. And there's different versions of what they do with that hour. So it's like a sort of a silly story like that. And I've been thinking about this idea of immortality and playing with time, but from the point of view of one character. And then I had my epiphany moment, which I can tell all of you about, but it actually did happen. My husband who's sitting right here, hello, is very aware as parents of 4 young children, neither of us get a lot of time to ourselves. And at one point, sort of as a joke for Mother's Day, he gave me a waterproof notepad to keep in the shower. So, because this is like one of the few situations where no one is bothering me. And I was literally in the shower, and I should say that I'm a Torah reader. I chant the Torah publicly on a pretty regular basis, and so it's something that I think about a lot. And these words just popped into my head, which I will explain in a moment, and I wrote it down on my little pad in the shower, because that's the only way I could think of it, which were Ele Toldot Rachel, which means it means something like, these are the generations of Rachel. This is a phrase you have for many male characters in the Torah, yes. Right? Where it says, like, these are the generations of Noah, these are the generations of Jacob or Abraham. This is sort of, it's a bit before, in all those parts in the Bible that are translated in English as like so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. They're all preceded by this Ele Toldot so-and-so. Mm-hmm. These are the generations of this person. And I thought, like, they're never about women. And I thought about this figure of Rachel Imenu, right? Rachel, the matriarch from the Torah, who is this figure who is, she's the only person among the matriarchs and patriarchs who's not buried in the cave of Machpelah with the other patriarchs and matriarchs. She dies on the road while giving birth. And there's this beautiful phrase where it says, a voice is heard in Ramah that she's crying for her children, for they are no more. This is from the prophets. But this idea that this is a woman who's perpetually mourning over her children. And this was something that also this name Rachel was my grandmother's Hebrew name, and my grandmother died very young, and her death had an enormous impact on my family and on my mother, and just on the way that I saw life and death and family relations as I grew older, and I just sort of all of those things came together in this character. Who's sort of this eternal mother who never dies. So, your turn. Oh, I didn't answer that. Yeah, so how long did it take to write the book? I guess like 2 or 3 years, which is pretty average for. I now have a pattern because I have 5 books, right? So they're all about 3 years, 2 or 3 years. Yes.
That's a good model to live by. My story is a tad more dramatic, although this moment of epiphany I actually really like it.
Because in the shower.
With the pad, yes. It's so good. I came to New York 18 years ago because of a certain person who's sitting in the room here with us, Caroline, who's now my wife, and she's in the room 2 seats away from your husband.
They like us.
And that's nice. Yeah. They still like us.
Yes.
It's amazing. So I arrived in New York 18 years ago. It was right when I was editing the last edits of my first book. And I came because, we had a great love story that was rekindled, and we decided to give it a chance. And so I was walking around in New York, taking it all in. It was a very open-hearted time in my life, a very inspired time. And I just finished a book. I was in a good place. I just, found the love of my life. That was a great thing. So I was open to this adventure. and taking it in. Also, through Carolyn, I met a lot of American Jews and American non-Jews that Israelis don't usually meet, because, when you come as an Israeli, and I had an insider, so I got to know a world that usually my friends who come from Israel, they have less access to, because they hang out more with Israelis and more, with other immigrants. So it was really a very strong experience for me, a very strong experience. Very rich, immensely rich moment in my life where I discovered this wonderful, lush, cultural and architectural and financial empire that we know little about as Israelis. And all this accumulated and accumulated. And then 2 years after I arrived, 2 months before our first daughter was born, it just suddenly kind of came to fruition and erupted. And the way it happened was that I just saw this idea, the gesture of a very American, secular, successful Jew who is the embodiment of the successful, self-pleased New York as we know and love it, that is being visited and almost snatched back by his previous incarnation, that is really a kind of the collective ancient memory that we all carry with us, but we are not in touch with. So this was a sudden moment for me. I cannot remember where I was or what I was doing, but what I do remember is that I ran to the laptop and I wrote the first and the last paragraphs.
Wow.
And kind of sealed the story and had the whole arch in my head. And then it took me 10 whole years. I know. It was the hardest and craziest thing I've done, and thank God it was many moments where I didn't know that I'm going to complete this. It was such a big work that kind of dictated its own pace, dictated its own tone. I was really struggling with it, like Yaakov and Jacob and their book. It was not clear who was going to win, if me or the novel. It was a big struggle. And thankfully, we made it somehow in one piece. And so it was for me, the inception of this novel was dramatic and kind of big.
Great. So one last question. These are such deeply Jewish books, both of them. And I wonder how you feel about being labeled Jewish writers. I know it's a question that often people are not, labeled people aren't always so comfortable with. What do you think?
Well, I know you and I have spoken about this before, but I find that with each of my books, I'm put in this situation where I'm invited to participate in a panel with other writers, and I don't think that's going to happen today, but usually all the other people on the panel are like, no, I'm not a Jewish writer, and I'm thinking, like, why are we all sitting here in a Jewish museum? Right? And it's like, you could debate what makes somebody a Jewish writer, but what I've learned over the 15 years of writing these books is that what makes somebody a Jewish writer in America today is their likelihood of being asked to participate on a panel during which they're going to be asked this question, do you consider yourself a Jewish writer? So, Ruby and I totally qualify.
Yes.
I think to me, what's significant, I think people, don't like being labeled because they don't want to feel like they're only can do one thing in their work or something like that. But for me, I think that I'm drawing so much on this Jewish literary tradition that's very much how I see myself as part of that Jewish literary tradition, or at least I aspire to be part of that Jewish literary tradition. So for me, it wouldn't really make sense to look at my writing in other ways, although of course readers in other communities have seen these books in other ways. I often go speak at churches and and people think of me as a spiritual writer, or a writer about religion, or a writer about family. So I mean, there's a lot of, you write one book, and then of course everybody who's reading your book is reading a totally different book than the book you wrote, and which is, sometimes they're reading a better book than the one you wrote, which is nice.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I consider myself a Jewish writer.
Everything she said, it's just amazing that it's actually endlessly amusing to me to hear everybody denying the fact that they're Jewish writers. It started, I think, from Roth and Bellow and gang, who were, but they really were the generation that really wanted and managed to, in many ways, break the walls of this literary ghetto. But in my opinion, they're very Jewish writers, and the fact that they don't want to be called that makes them even more Jewish writers, Because who but a Jew would deny the fact that he's a Jewish writer? I not only have no problem with calling myself a Jewish writer, I'm, exactly as you said, I'm very proud. It's a very proud and humbling a place to call myself, to write in the great tradition of Jewish literature. Goes all the way back to Bereshit and the wonderful, that's such a privilege to work in this tradition. And I will add one more thing, that I don't see it as a ghetto, and I don't see it as a limiting factor, because I actually think that the fact that you dig your well deep enough, I feel that the deeper you dig, the actually more universal it becomes. I feel that actually when you dare to go deep into your own roots, you meet down deep there the roots of other people. And people connect to your work in ways that are amazing. And I learned it from some of the Anglo and American Indian writers who did this. And I could see that they are so Indian or Indian American or Anglo-Indian. At the same time, I feel like I know them. I feel like I understand. They managed to touch my roots. And that was a great inspiration for me to just dare to do that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your...
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your candor and generosity and great wisdom and this very powerful idea of, the presence of the past, in every moment. What we're going to do now is actually let Dara and Ruby go downstairs where we can greet them and buy their books. So why don't you head down, and again, let's have a round of applause for them.